Hey guys, sebchoof here. There are too many insanely overpowered items in Realm of the Mad God. Some items are just so broken that they completely invalidate all other items in their type. Like for example, over half of the classes in the game have an ability that is so strong that there is little reason to use any other one of the same type. As updates come out, more of these insane items get released that are either blatantly broken, or they were existing items that were perceived as weak, but they just get buffed to the moon. Even the items on this list that do drop from endgame shouldn't be as broken as they are. Now there's so many overpowered items, but in this video I'll be going through my top 10 in my opinion. Let's get into it, mates. Starting at number 10, the only returning entry from the previous video is the Snake Eye Ring. Now if you haven't given this item a good chance, you're probably like, Seb, I've seen this item all the time. It drops from the snake pit, from crying out loud. It can't be good. I don't even bother picking this up anymore. There's no way it's good enough to be on this list. Well, that's where you're wrong, matey. At least you're right about the accessibility. You get this item way too often, at least 1 out of 10 times from the snake pit. And it's tied for the cheapest item to craft in the forge. But that's part of the reason why I consider it OP. It has such a strong effect, not the strongest on this list, but the power of the item for its accessibility is just too high. Even my dog could probably get it. But how strong is this effect? When you use your ability while wearing the ring, you get speedy for 2 seconds. This might not sound that crazy to you right away, but it is for a couple of reasons. Some classes struggle with a lack of speed. Only a handful of classes in the game are designed to be fast, and because of that they might be lacking damage or tankiness. But then there's classes that are immobile, and because of that do a lot of damage, like the Summoner for example. But not if you have the Snake Eye Ring. With a quick ring swap and an ability usage, you increase your movement speed by 50% for 2 seconds. And you can do this every 5 seconds, meaning that on average, if you use this ring consistently, you become on average 20% faster, which equates roughly to 25 speed, so no ring compares. Since the second fastest ring is a tier 6 speed ring, or a candy ring, they both give you 10 speed. So while using Snake Eye Ring, you'll find yourself farming in general much faster, but it's even better than a 25 speed ring, because you can choose when these bursts of speed happen. This is a big deal because if you're getting TP'd on by Oryx Free, or if you're getting chased by the purple bird in hard mode shadows, or another spooky situation like that, you can just concentrate the ring's energy into that one moment to get away. You also don't have to always be wearing the ring, which is one of the craziest parts. Since you only have to swap into it for a split second and use your ability to gain its full benefit and go back to your other ring, it's kind of like you're wearing 2 rings at once, because you're not wearing Snake Eye Ring for its base stats, that's for sure. And with a divine pet, you'll be able to use this ring non-stop. In my opinion, this should be at least a white bag from the snake pit, or even the crawling depths with how good it is. But that's just a game theory. Next up, we have our first of many abilities that destroy all their competition in their same weapon type. There's so many that I couldn't fit them all in this video, but these are definitely the most overpowered ones of the bunch. First up, we have the Polarity Poison. Now the Polarity Poison isn't easy to get. It's a white bag from the Twilight Archmage from Shadows. Because of that, you're probably like, yeah, this item should have a slight edge over all other poisons, and I would agree. But this is no slight edge we're talking about here, and it is stupidly more overpowered than all of its other poison sisters. It puts all of them to shame. Let me first show you how it looks when you use it. So this is the tier 7 poison. Looks how you would expect a poison to look like, and it deals 1130 damage for 110 mana before wisdom scaling. And then the Murky Toxin looks interesting. Deals a bit more damage at 1400 damage for 120 mana before any vitality scaling. But to get the full damage of this poison, you have to hit both the bombs that it lobs. And then it deals more than tier 7 poison. Makes sense so far, right? And then you have the Polarity Poison. Okay, what the fuck? Well, surely Deca balanced this well. It literally covers the entire screen. So how this poison exactly works is it shoots its primary grenade, dealing 1250 damage before wisdom scaling, and then it lobs another 13 secondary bombs, dealing 450 damage each. Okay, well you're probably thinking at least this item is only good at massive area of effect damage. It still only deals 1250 damage to your primary target, right? Right? Well, the enemy you have your cursor over when you lob the poison actually gets hit for not only the main 1250 damage, which is already great considering the area it covers after, but the enemy that your cursor is over actually gets hit by 5 of the secondary 450 damage grenades, dealing a total of 3500 damage for 120 mana. Who? What? Why? If you thought that was all this poison had to offer, guess again. Every single enemy that gets damaged by this also gets slowed. So basically the entire screen. And slow can be one of the strongest negative effects to apply on enemies, especially for endgame content, because unlike Paralyze, most of the enemies are not slow immune. So it turns endgame bosses into little sissies when they're trying to chase you. How is this real? This item would be much better balanced in my opinion if the enemy you're lobbing the poison at only gets damaged by the primary grenade, making murky poison a slightly better option for single target damage because it is hard to hit, but if you do choose to use the murky over the polarity, you are missing out on the amazing area of effect damage and slow that the poison provides. So that would still make Polarity Poison the best poison in the game after that nerf, in my opinion. Next up, we have another ability, the Vanguard's Visage. Historically, the warrior has been really strong even without ability items that can reliably transfer mana to damage, like how the assassin does with its poison. And this was because of the warrior's high damage and the ability to almost permanently have the Berserk buff. Then the Helm of Draconic Dominance got released, and it was weaker before, but it got buffed, and it provides a balanced option for warriors to transfer mana into damage, instead of having your mana bar always full because of your credit card pet. For 95 mana, this ability deals 1950 damage, so it almost deals double the damage per mana cost of the Assassin's tier 7 poison and the Murky Toxin. But it's much harder to hit. You have to be within a 2.8 tile range, basically in front of the enemy, to hit all of the shots, so I think it's fair. Balance. What's not fair is this new warrior ability that came out, the Vanguard's Visage. Now this helmet is so crazy. It was buffed to over 50% recently because it was seen as too weak on release. How it worked is when you press space, you shoot out a sword of 24 shots dealing 100 damage each for 115 mana. Realistically, the amount of shots you would hit would vary, but on the bigger and more important enemies that are still or chasing you, you'd hit 22 shots. So that would be a total of 2200 armor piercing damage for 115 mana, so about 100 damage per mana spent, which is basically on par with the Draconis helmet. But these shots were easier to hit, because you would hit them within a 4.5 tile range, depending on your wisdom stat. But man, it got so insanely buffed more recently, they dropped the mana cost to 100 and increased the damage per shot by 50% to 150 armor piercing damage per shot. So now with every spacebar you're dealing 3300 damage if you do hit 22 shots, while the ST Helm does 3 times less, and is much harder to hit. And the Shatter's Helm has the much better effect of Berserk, instead of the temporary increase in maximum HP. Thanks to this helmet, it actually brought back the solo warrior glory, making it the best solo speedrunning class again after many years of it falling behind the other classes due to power creep. Before this helmet, majority of players were actually saying that warrior was one of the worst endgame classes, with so many classes taking over because of their new item releases. But this helm single-handedly saved the warrior, but maybe a bit too much because now endgame players would rank this class as one of the strongest. Since people realized the helmet's potential, I think it would be fair if the helmet got its damage and mana dropped closer to what it used to be, because man, it's just too busted. The overpowered abilities don't stop there. Next up we have the Oryx's Escutcheon. This shield is super similar to the previous entry on this list, with it being perceived as weak initially, but actually in reality just being harder to use, and then receiving an insane buff to all of its numbers. How it works is when you press space for 100 mana, it calls down 3 sequential beams in front of you within 1.2 seconds that stun, deal armor piercing damage, and make you wonder why. Now this item is a white bag from Oryx free, so again, if it was the best shield by a small margin compared to the others, it would make sense. But this is not just a small margin we're talking about here, it is much better than all others, and I'll show you why. First of all, let's get into the damage. All other shields have always been reliable for damage. The Spiteful Scutum, the tier 7 shield, the Shield of Ogma, and the Cogbold Cower shield all do around 1600 damage per 100 mana spent, while the Escutcheon does 3300 armor breaking damage per 100 mana spent. So double damage and armor piercing, so it ignores the enemy defense. And the first shields that I mentioned, most of them shoot the shots out in a cone, requiring you to be extremely close to deal full damage. But Escutcheon is much easier to hit because the beam it calls down in front has a free tile radius and does go a decent amount in front of you. Because of this, it also makes it the highest range shield by far, not even close. The Spiteful Scutum used to be seen as really unique for its range, since it had a 3.5 tile range being the most, but Escutcheon is almost double that, with an insane 5.75 tile range. With all this craziness, you'd think the benefits of Escutcheon would stop there. The damage is more than enough to make it the best shield by far, but this shield also still stuns longer than most shields if you hit all the beams. Since they do 2 seconds of stunning each, after the last beam hits, and if the first one hits as well, it's a total of 3.2 seconds stun, while the tiered shields stun for only 3 seconds. This shield is the only shield that can also hit enemies over walls, making it ideal for safely clearing minions and damaging things like crystals and tablets over walls. The Escutcheon killed any reason to use other shields, like for example the tier 7 shield, which is actually harder to obtain because you can't forge tier 7 abilities, and tier 7 abilities do drop more often than Escutcheon from Oryx 3. But to get the specific tier 7 ability that you're looking for is an insane grind. This shield is so broken that a player named Charizard did a solo void with only that item. I don't know how many items could do that if there is any other items. The only downside is that the shield takes 1.2 seconds for all the beams to land. So if you're versing a fast enemy, you might miss a singular beam, but even if you do that, you're still dealing 2200 true damage, which is about a 40% more than the other shields we talked about, and it still stuns for 2.4 seconds, almost as long as the other shields too. Now when I heard this item was getting buffed around 3 years ago, I was amazed because I already knew the potential of the shield. It worked so well against steal and chasing enemies, especially while rushing things like Crystal, since the shield gave you 7 speed, so the buff was so crazy in my eyes. I think the item should be changed closer to what it used to be, so it gives other shields a chance. Next up, we have another absolutely bonkers ability. This time it's the Archer's Sentry Turret. To show you how disgusting this item's power is, let me first show you what used to be the best quiver for damage, the Quiver of Shadows, which drops from the Void. So this is a quiver that you have to bust your balls farming endgame to get, and good luck getting it without a Discord that organizes Void runs. But the payoff is real, or at least it used to be. You got a quiver that shoots a cone of 6 shots, dealing in total 2700 armor piercing damage for 80 mana, but you have to bust your balls in combat as well, because you have to be within 2.8 tiles to hit all your shots, which from an item design perspective is really smart. You have to risk it for the biscuit to do full damage. And then came the Sentry Turret, which is an ST ability for the Archer that is so much easier to obtain. You just have to get an ST Master's Chest, which is most common from Exalt dungeons. You can get it relatively safely from doing the Nest and the Cult. It even drops from the Puppet Encore, and then you need to use an ST ability and 80 ST Forge to craft it. So yeah, it's way easier to get, and it is almost 2 times more expensive mana wise to use it, but the damage is just what even, man. The ability has 3 modes, and the only one you should worry about is the gun turret mode, and when I tried to test how much damage this thing did, the DPS dummy wouldn't help me because the turret lasts longer than you can test the damage on the dummy. So what I did is I went into the Lost Halls and tried on the starting room pillars. These have 15,000 HP and 35 defense, but the turret does so much damn damage that with 1 ability use it actually killed it. So the turret should be dealing at the very least to a 0 defense target 17,250 damage per 150 mana used, or 115 damage per mana spent. Compare that to the Void Quiver, which deals 33.75 damage per mana spent. So yeah, that's almost 3 times less. And the Sentry Turret has a 4 tile range to deal full damage instead of needing to be within 2.8 tiles risking your life. So it's ridiculously easy to use because of the range, but it gets even easier because you don't even have to do anything after putting the turret down. It shoots on its own. It just needs to be within 4 tile range of an enemy and you can walk far away from it and it's still doing its thing. It almost couldn't be easier. Only downside is that if the enemy moves fast, the turret can miss its shot. But it does have an extremely high projectile speed, so it has to be a really fast enemy. Keep in mind, I did the calculations with the ST bow from the same set equipped, which makes the turret shoot double its shots. And it's not a bad weapon on its own, it competes with the tier 13 bow for damage. And to craft this, it takes another ST Master's Chest, but only half of the ST Forge required and an ST weapon instead. And one of the craziest things is when you do have the ST bow equipped, the turret also slows. So this can be one of the easiest and most reliable ways to slow as an archer. And you don't even have to always have the bow equipped. you can just swap to it for less than a second to put down the enhanced turret, then swap back to a better bow. Without the ST bow, the turret does half the damage with no slow, which is still double the Void Quiver's damage and safer. This item could receive a 50% damage nerf, and it would still be a competitive option for the Archer ability, and that would allow Archer players to actually consider other options. Okay, for the next entry, you're going to have to guess what it is. What's in this bag? What do you think it is? Oh, it's gone. Because it's the Fool's Prism. What a piece of shit item, man. This item might not be overpowered in the traditional sense by having high damage or stats or something. In fact, it's one of the weakest items in the game, but its effect is so overpowered that it's changed how we all think about and react to white bags. It single-handedly killed my instant dopamine rush when seeing one of those beautiful, pointy, light blue ribbon white bags. This is a prism ability for the Trickster that drops from the machine, and what it does is when you use your ability with it equipped, it places a white bag on your cursor. So as you can imagine, it's amazing for trolling, but if you're like me and you've been a victim to it too much, or even a couple of times, you've adapted to it. No longer do you get instantly excited at the sight of a white bag. I also don't want to look inside the bag early by holding control or hovering my cursor over the bag. It feels like it ruins it. Instead, what I do is wait a few seconds for when the decoy would disappear, and then step on it. Get this shit out of the game, man. Or at least make it that the decoy has to spawn on top of the user. Next on the list, we have the Royal Guard's Cuirass, which is a heavy armor that drops from the shadows. It drops from the minions in the first and second section, but more so the ones in the tablet room and the tablets themselves. And it gives 60 HP, 20 defense, and 10 vitality. Those are some pretty crazy stats, but the real crazy part of it is its unique effect. When shooting, when in combat, it gives 1.2 seconds of invulnerability every 20 seconds. Now 1.6 seconds might not sound like too much, but when you're in an insanely stressful dungeon and you need a guardian angel, you can be saved many times by this armor. Like for example, in dungeons with many insta-pops like shatters, if you feel like you're in a pickle, you can shoot with the armor on while in combat and get out of a tight situation. This is also the only item in the game that gives you invulnerability multiple times during a single sicken phase. So it works well in Moonlight Villages, both in the first bosses and Umi. It also does great in shatters in the patience phase and the advanced cog finale. Even if you're being lazy and just using order file, having the armor proc as much as possible, it would prevent so much damage in total since it makes you invincible almost 10% of the time. You might as well consider it an armor that makes you prevent 10% damage in that case, and that's the worst case scenario. As you can imagine, this armor also helps you deal more damage, making you be able to be extremely close range with swords like the tier 14 flail and demon blade, and another sword that we'll talk about later that breaks the balance of the game. Funny thing is, this item was already nerfed. The invulnerability used to be longer and the cooldown was shorter, so I guess nerf it more. Before the next entry, I really gotta ask, why the hell have you not subscribed yet, man? Also, press the like button so I know that you enjoy these kinds of videos. And I have to give a big shout out to the biggest supporters of the streams and videos, the Twitch subs, the YouTube members, and the patrons. I couldn't do this without you. Consider becoming a YouTube member or Twitch sub or patron if you'd like to support what I do. So we've been talking about overpowered abilities, which are made even more OP by OP pets that give mana regeneration, but there's more items that can make it even more OP. And one of the best examples of this is the Twilight Gemstone, a ring that drops from the Twilight Archmage from the Shadows. This gemstone gives 110 mana, 8 def, 5 speed, and 5 whiz, but most importantly, it reduces your mana spend by 30%, meaning that you can dish out almost double the abilities that you normally would. The MP cost reduction of the gemstone also stacks with other MP cost reducing items like the Robe of the Mad Scientist and the Mystic Syndicate attire, which decrease MP costs by 20 and 15% respectively. So if you have a crazy divine pet for mana regen and one of the broken abilities, despite Twilight Gemstone not giving any DPS stats, it is still actually the best DPS ring in the game. But there's still one that could be better. A super similar and better option if you're closer to the enemy is the Cage no Hikari, which drops from Umi. This one actually has a weaker reduced mana spend effect. Instead, it reduces mana spend by 10%, which is much worse, but it's made better by the fact that it has a better stat line of 100 HP, 100 MP, 5 whiz and 5 vit, but the main actual draw of this ring is that it has another unique effect, which spawns flames when you use your ability. These flames last for 6 seconds, and all of them deal damage and have extra effects. The yellow one curses, the blue one slows, and the pink one gives yourself healing. Using your abilities means that allies or your other own items that have healing, slows, or curses are much less useful. So unfortunately, items like the Shield of Flowing Clarity aren't even considered for endgame players. On top of this, it deals a decent amount of extra damage. It's very RNG based, because if you have different colors they upgrade each other, but when testing on one attempt, my flames did an extra 5.3k damage over 5 seconds. The spirit damage and effects can also be increased by equipping the armors that you can get from the first bosses. And honestly, if you've gotten the Cage no Hikari, chances are you've gotten one of each of these armors because they're much easier to obtain. There's the Ethereal Happy, the Flowering Kimono, and the Sage's Wakibiki, with the last one being my favorite since it belongs to the melees and was actually an item that I really wanted to put on this list. When equipping this one, it guarantees slow spawning flames to spawn, as well as the random one from your ring if you still have it equipped. And now the flames levels increase in power. When testing the damage from the flames with the ring and the armor, it increased to a whopping 13k damage in 5 seconds on the target dummy. That's on par with many primary weapons. With this armor, you would also get a permanent slow on the enemy, assuming they're not immune, and you're within range, and you're spacing out your abilities. Both the Twilight Gemstone and the Cage no Hikari are the most common rings used for speedruns and challenges because of their power. I don't think there's an issue with these rings alone. Their issue is that they exacerbate how broken some abilities and pets are already in the game. If they didn't exist, the rings would not be so great. Okay, now things are getting even more crazy with number 2. We have the newest release on the list, the Fury Flail. There's a lot of drama about this melee weapon right now, and many people watching this video probably expected this to be here. As part of the newest ST set, there's a flail for melees that effortlessly outdamages all other swords. There's many problems with it. One, it's extremely accessible, and not exclusive to endgame like some other weapons that deserve to be the highest damage. It has similar forge requirements to the turrets that we talked about earlier. It requires 80 ST Forge, an ST weapon, and an ST Master's Chest. Then you can farm 4 Resplendent Bows from Ancient Ruins, and there you have it, a weapon that outdamages all others. That includes one where you have to do on average 40 advanced nests in my experience to get the B engraving. I'm referring to the engraved Pirate King's Cutlass, which used to be the highest damage sword deservingly, but the flail is so much better. Look! A 20% damage increase. And it does 30% more damage than the T14 flail, which is also a fairly balanced item because it's a rare drop from completing the shatters. Keep in mind, with the flail you have to be really close to hit all the shots because it shoots out 3 shots, one at a 4.6 tile range, another at 3 tiles, and another at 2 tiles. But 70% of the damage is from the shot that goes out the furthest. And that furthest shot outranges most melee weapons for some reason, including now the second best sword, the engraved Pirate King's Cutlass, by an extra 50% range. There actually isn't really a sword that outranges this flail, which is concerning. If you thought that was all, we're not done yet. The flail has another massive benefit, where instead the flail shots returning like normal flails do, it spins around the user, making it cover so much area and makes it extremely strong for clearing groups of enemies. I'm not sure why Deca does public testing for these if the items come out this broken. I think the Fury Flail should have its range and damage nerfed by 40%, because in my opinion I still think it would be a strong weapon for how easy it is to acquire. And the first place goes to the Seal of Blasphemous Prayer, or more commonly known as the Oreo. The Oreo is absolutely game breaking, just like everything on this list, but this is the greatest example, and I can't believe that it's been untouched considering its brother Crystal Shield got absolutely gutted, or more so reworked, so the shield wouldn't be game breaking with invincibility. The Seal of Blasphemous Prayer costs 120 mana and gives healing and damaging to your group for 5 seconds, but the most OP part of it is that it gives 1.6 seconds of invulnerability, just like the Royal Guard's Cuirass we talked about earlier, but it also scales with Wiz, items, and it has only a 5-second cooldown, meaning that if you spam space, you'll be invulnerable for 32% of the time, assuming no extra scaling from extra wisdom. So that's the worst case scenario, just simply spamming it with no brain. It's even better if you time it to avoid lethal shots. People learning endgame dungeons will have an extremely easier time using Oreo. It's also amazing in Moonlight Village, where you can use Oreo in almost every single phase, especially second phases, except for the finales. If you're invincible for 32% of the time, can you imagine how much easier Moonlight Village would be, or just the game in general? You can also combine this with the Cuirass for more invincibility, and that will make you invincible for 40% of the time. Imagine being invincible for almost half the time while playing this game. Cuirass can be tough to get though, but if you get the Oreo blueprint, it is so easy to forge. The reason why Cuirass and other legendary items can be annoying to craft is because it has required legendaries from the same dungeon. In Cuirass's case and other Shatters items, you need 2 Shatters legendary whites and 2 regular whites. But for Oreo, it has no required whites. So you can just get 4 of the most garbage legendary items and craft the most overpowered item in the game that you otherwise probably wouldn't have gotten, because it's an event white, so it's extremely rare and not exactly farmable. If you haven't gotten the Oreo blueprint, what you have to do is you have to get 50 regular schematics, which is easy. You have a chance to get one from completing easier Exalt dungeons like Cult or Nest, and then you have to trade them into the Tinkerer when the Oreo blueprint is available. As you can imagine, it makes it much easier to get into a closer range to deal full damage with hard to hit weapons, like the Flail and Cage no Hikari we just talked about, but you can also utilize an insane combo with the Eye Ring to deal crazy damage on top of your weapon. I think the Oreo should at the very least go down to 1 second of invulnerability duration, so it can't just be spammed for survivability. I mean, it still will be able to, but it will be less effective, and in that case, the skilled players can still enjoy utilizing the damage reflection with the eye combo. I wanted to include so many more items on this list, but we had to keep it to 10. Was there an item that you were expecting that I missed? Comment below. If you want to see 10 more overpowered items, but for beginners instead, click the video on the screen. Peace.